Hello and welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Colourgraph. Hi there, I'm Violet Moller. In this episode, we are off to glorious ancient Rome and the last days of Augustus. In 1995, Oxford University Press began publishing a new series of books called Very Short Introductions, which they billed as stimulating ways into new subjects. 26 years on, and there are now over 350 titles, providing readers with expert guides to subjects as diverse as algebra, chaos, the Vikings, and Shakespeare's comedies. They are an incomparable jumping off point for anyone embarking on a new topic, small enough to slip into your pocket, but sure to give you a clear overview. As today's guest, Professor Llewelyn Morgan, explains, they are extremely difficult to write, as they require huge amounts of information to be distilled down into a slim, concise volume. Llewelyn is the author of the recently published Very Short Introduction to Ovid. So today we're setting off on a journey to ancient Rome at a crucial moment in its history, the early 1st century AD. The golden age of Augustus was drawing to a close as the great emperor reached the end of his life at the impressive age of 75. He had presided over a hugely successful period in Roman history, during which his achievement of the Pax Romana enabled culture to flourish on an unprecedented scale. Llewelyn Morgan is a scholar of Roman literature at Brasenose College, Oxford, and has written numerous articles on various aspects of Roman poetry, primarily focusing on the works of Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. Morgan has been teaching at the University of Oxford for 20 years. I'd like to welcome you to Travels Through Time, Llewelyn. Thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
Today we're going to be going back to the golden age of Augustus and the Roman Empire, and we're going to talk about your book, which is Ovid, A Very Short Introduction. And before we get into the actual history, I wondered if you'd like to tell us a bit about this series, which I believe is produced by Oxford University Press, because it's an absolutely brilliant way into any subject. And I think that there's 650 volumes now on subjects that are just so diverse. So can you just tell us a little bit about it, please?
Yeah, it's a brilliant little series which I've used a lot when I've sort of needed to have a rapid introduction to a particular subject. I remember I was reading one on Tibetan Buddhism at some stage. I'm not sure whether that was the one that made me sort of contact OUP and say, would you like any classical subjects that you'd like covered? I mean, it's a really good exercise from the point of view of the writer as well, because you need to know the subject quite deeply in order to sort of nutshell it, if that's the expression, sort of take the essentials out of it, and it really forces you to kind of clarify what the key issues are in relation to particular texts or particular authors. I wouldn't necessarily encourage anybody to read my book on Ovid, but do read, if you've got any interest in the subjects that are covered by the Very Short Introductions, do get into them, because they're fantastic. They're really
They're very useful. I've got the Very Short Introduction to the History of Astronomy on my desk at the moment, and it's been invaluable. Okay, wonderful. Well, let's start making our way back to ancient Rome, and we're going back to the 1st century AD. And I was wondering if you could just explain a bit about the political situation in Rome. There's been a lot of changes. Augustus is the emperor, or has been the emperor. So can you just set that up for us and describe what it would have been like?
Yes, okay. So Augustus has been in power for quite a long time, in fact a significantly long time, much longer than people would have expected, because he was quite a sickly individual for most of his life. He's managed to transform Rome without upsetting anybody, transform the politics of Rome without upsetting people too seriously. Essentially, what has happened is an oligarchic system known as the Republic, which fancied itself as democratic, but really kept power within quite a narrow group of elite families. That has collapsed under the weight of the growth of the empire, and Augustus has come along, simplifying it somewhat, but has come along and has created a new version of administration and politics within Rome, which shares enough of what had gone on before to be acceptable to the elite of Rome, but is also much better designed to run the empire. Now, for convenience, we describe Augustus as the first emperor of Rome. It is in his time, it's a much less easy to define what Augustus is, because there's this sort of constant negotiation with old ways of doing things or existing ways of doing things. So what we have as Augustus's reign comes to an end is a kind of a more or less stable system, which has never been very clearly defined. When something like that approaches, the end of the life of somebody like Augustus, it becomes potentially fairly tricky.
Because, of course, the succession is then tested. Is this going to carry on into the future?
Yes, indeed.
And can you please describe the cultural life of Rome under Augustus? Because that's what we're going to be focusing on when we talk about Ovid. I know that he was one of the first great propagandists, wasn't he? I mean, he was really, really good at creating an aura of power and reputation around himself. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. In his own right, Augustus is very determined to tell a set of stories about his role and his role in the kind of larger history of Rome, to present himself as a kind of a natural development of the history of Rome. He's also, possibly from a literary point of view, the most important thing he manages to do is kind of persuade a lot of extremely talented authors to share that essential vision. So you can see Augustus doing things that we could describe as propaganda in the sort of architecture of Rome and the various very meaningful kind of structures that he put up around Rome. But what you also have are people like Virgil and Horace and poets like this who are not being told to do anything. They're not being sort of forced to produce this stuff, but they do sort of feel a compulsion to celebrate in subtle ways, but nevertheless celebrate this new development in Rome. Now, it's probably not coincidental that Augustus is all about renewal, and there's also simultaneously this amazing explosion of literary activity, but it's a fairly subtle connection. It's not, Augustus isn't controlling everything in quite that sort of blatant.
But he did create this peace and stability, the Pax Augusta, and that, I suppose, enabled or freed up these people to live a much more cultural life, because there wasn't so much emphasis on battles. And is that right or not?
No, that's absolutely fair. And it's, Ovid in particular is very much an embodiment of the Augustan peace, which is sort of paradoxical since he came a crop from Augustus. But yes, undoubtedly, it's only in a context of peace that there's the scope for the kind of literary and architectural and general cultural activity that there is under Augustus. I think it's fair to say that the leading sort of literary figures of the Augustan period, Ovid is one, but Virgil and Horace are others. To quite a strange degree, they're focused on what's gone before rather than on the Augustan peace. And what's motivating a poem like Virgil's Aeneid more than anything else is actually an awareness of the kind of the horrors of the civil war that has gone before. So it's a combination of things. Yes, there's a peace and an order which encourages cultural activities, but there's also a sense that we must not go back to that. There's a high motivation that comes from the terrible things that Rome has.
Learning the mistakes of the past, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a bit more about Ovid now specifically. And I believe that he was sent to Rome with his brother, and his father had high hopes for him to go into politics. And he was obviously very well born and part of the elite. And then I just want to read this little quote because I thought it's so charming, and it's a really good introduction into the personality of Ovid. And he basically says that he was sent to study and he was supposed to go into politics and law, I think specifically, but it was just no good. It just didn't work. He couldn't help it. He was just a poet. And he says, I was affected by my father's words, and leaving Helicon wholly behind me, I attempted to write words freed from metre, but of its own volition song found its fitting rhythm, and whatever I tried to say was verse. And I just think that's so charming. It's such a brilliant description, and it really also shows us a bit his personality, because he had a great sense of humour, didn't he? And
Yeah, I mean, yes, he has too good a sense of humour. He's the kind of guy who can't resist making a joke. But yeah, I mean, he's what we describe as a kind of a local elite. He's from a very, very posh family in sort of central Italy, basically, who are exactly the kind of people who are sort of rising to power under Augustus, or exerting a certain degree of sort of power under Augustus. And Ovid, had he pursued the career that his father wanted for him, would have been the first senator of his people, the first Pygmalion senator, which in terms of sort of recent Italian history is both a very natural development and a really significant process. Ovid, throughout his life, seems to be kind of in very, very elevated circles. His connections are the most significant people within Rome. But as you've quoted him as saying, he pursues, because his father asked him to do this, the first steps in a public career, and law and politics are sort of inseparable, really, in Rome. He seems quite good at them. There aren't many things that he isn't good at. He'd have been a good politician probably, but it just doesn't click with him, and he can't help writing in verse. So he turns to poetry instead. And his dad says things like, that Homer, did he make any money?
It's brilliant. It's the sort of conversation that a parent could be having today.
Indeed.
Their child says, "I want to be a stand-up comedian." Well, and so that point you make about him being from this very small elite world, that was also very much the case for poetry. I mean, the poetry that he wrote was not being read by the masses, by people on the street. It was very, very much for a very small elite circle.
No, that's absolutely right. That the what I've described as an explosion of poetry in under Augustus remains art that's kind of appreciated by a fairly narrow group of people. It requires of its readers very high education, knowledge of Greek literature as well as Roman literature, the kinds of sort of levels of cultural capital that isn't generally widely available. Ovid achieves, I mean, it's very hard to say, but Ovid seems to achieve slightly broader penetration than most authors, actually. His poetry is performed on stage. Some of his poetry is performed on stage, he tells us, and if it's on stage, then suddenly there's more people watching it. I mean, it's limited by the amount of literacy that there is around. Still, yes, the fundamental sort of situation is a narrow group of kind of literary sophisticated people who are reading it.
Yes. Yeah, and so his most famous works were the Metamorphoses, which is a selection of stories, and they're mainly old stories, aren't they? Greek stories about transformation. Just describe a bit about his love poetry, and just so that we've got an idea of what he wrote and what he's actually famous for.
Yes, okay. So he's, Ovid sort of regards himself when he talks about himself. He talks about himself as an elegiac poet, and an elegiac poet really means a poet who's fundamentally about love poetry. where he starts is with books of poetry that he calls the amores, which means loves, which are kind of accounts of an alleged relationship or set of relationships he's had with a woman. It's worth appreciating though that Ovid is I think it's fair to say much more interested in poetry than he is in anything like love or anything of that kind. So this is highly sophisticated poetry, which is more sort of engaging with past love poetry than it is with any sort of actual relationship that he's necessarily having. As he moves through his career, one way of looking at it is that he's kind of ringing the changes on that kind of fundamental love poetry theme that he started with. So he writes a didactic poem, a teaching poem, where he sort of claims, on the basis of his huge experience as a lover, to be able to teach everybody else how to succeed. And the Metamorphoses is an epic poem, a huge poem, 15 book rolls long, which takes those old stories but mines them not only for stories of metamorphosis, of change, but also for the erotic, for love material, which is the wrong way to do epic. Fundamentally, it's an elegiac way to do epic. I'm sort of being a bit confusing here, but it's sort of bringing in a kind of an alternative way of doing poetry, a love-focused way of doing poetry, into a much more serious genre of poetry and tradition of poetry.
Okay. Well, let's go now to your year. So I have to ask you this question that we ask all our guests. If you could travel back in time to a year in history, which year would it be?
It would be AD 14.
And just set the scene for us generally before we go to your first moment. Just give us a general idea of what is happening in AD 14.
Okay, well, if you're Ovid, what is happening in AD 14 is that you're sitting in a small town on the Black Sea, staring very glumly out into space, basically, because you've been exiled from Rome for 6 years or so. If you're in Rome, you have been ruled, in some sense or other, by Augustus for a number of decades now, but he's reaching the end of his life, and some significant changes are coming along. If you're in the empire in general, well, those changes in Rome, those potential changes in Rome, are potentially having a destabilizing effect on things. Augustus had achieved sort of great stability. What's going to happen when Augustus isn't around anymore?
And what at this point, what are the limits of the empire? So how big is the empire at this point? Can you just give us a vague idea?
Probably, if you think of rivers in Europe, at any rate, Rome sort of controls everything in Europe up to the Rhine and then the Danube. That's the boundary there. They occupy a significant amount of the east, to the edge of Syria, somewhere like that,
Yeah.
and a strip of North Africa as well. Most importantly, they control Egypt, which is a very wealthy agricultural space, which Augustus took control of as one of the first kind of acts of his position of power.
And what about Spain? Because that was also very important agriculturally, wasn't it?
One of the most important things that Spain produced was silver, actually. So
Okay.
you couldn't coin your coins unless you had Spain. Yes, they have had Spain for a while. The Romans. It's where a lot of the activity against the Carthaginians took place a couple of centuries beforehand. So.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so can you take us to your first scene, please?
Yes. Okay. So the first scene is the funeral of Augustus. Now, it's very hard to date things very specifically, given the sources that we have or don't have. But Augustus has died in about the middle of August AD 14, and sometime early in September, he is a very, very elaborate funeral is held for him.
And how do we know about this funeral? Who wrote about? What are the sources?
There are various historical sources. Dio gives us quite a lot of material, but there are kind of little sort of fragments of pieces from various sources.
And do we have any idea what would there have been a procession through the streets? Would he have been? Where was he buried? Do we have any idea? Was he cremated?
Right. Yes. He was, and then buried in a mausoleum that still exists, and is just about to be reopened after having been renovated for a while in Rome, the mausoleum of Augustus. I mean, the main reason I would love to go back to AD 14, there are other places I'd like to go to, but I would love to see the funeral, because the funeral was an incredible spectacle. Yeah.
And can you describe what you think you would see if you were there?
Yes, his body in a bier, perhaps, or maybe in a closed coffin, is processed through the streets, and there are various things associated with the procession. So we're told that there are signs kind of reminding people of the important legislation that he passed, and symbolic representations of the countries that he'd conquered. These are things that have been imported from other important processions, like the triumph, which a triumphal general would have undertaken. And in fact, it's important to say that Augustus left instructions for his own funeral. Okay, so everything that's happening is kind of according to his instructions. The bit that really that I'd love to see, though, is something that Augustus' funeral takes from traditional elite Roman funerals. Elite Roman families had, in the kind of public space of their house, in the atrium of their house, they had collections of wax masks taken during the lives of their ancestors, which were kind of kept in little kind of cupboards, and on festive occasions the doors of the cupboards might be opened.
A bit like a modern photograph.
Yes. That's right, actually. Although you don't, I was going to say that you don't often put kind of garlands on photographs, or maybe you do, actually. I don't know. I don't wish to sort of tell people what to do with their photographs. At a funeral, though, as the latest member of the family, as it were, was taken out as a body and processed through Rome, they would be preceded by actors wearing the masks of the ancestors, set in chronological order and going in front of the newly dead person. And those actors would be wearing the clothes associated with the highest achievement of those ancestors. Clothing in Rome is very kind of status coordinated. So if you're a censor, you wear a particularly sort of spectacular toga. If you're a triumphal general, similarly, if you're a senator, blah blah blah. And all of these guys would be dressed up like that and would be moving in a carriage ahead of the corpse. And it's clear it's clear from something that Pliny the Elder says, who's an encyclopedist who sort of preserves lots of kind of interesting pieces of information. He says that whenever anybody in a family dies, the whole family is present, meaning everybody that's ever existed in the family is there. Okay, so elite funerals in general are kind of wonderfully weird. I mean, we tend to think of the Romans as sort of deeply practical people who built aqueducts and roads and beat up sort of Celts and stuff. Here's the Romans, in some sense, believing that the ancestors are present whenever one member of the family dies. Now that's elite funerals in general. What Augustus does with funerals of his own family, but then leaves instructions for his own family, is that it's not just his own family that are present, but potentially all the great people that have ever been in Rome. We see reference to Pompey the Great, who is a kind of distant relative of Augustus, so you can kind of argue that, but he's there. Romulus is there, the first king of Rome. And I'm just imagining the experience of watching this procession through the streets, because it's like the entire history of Rome is kind of reanimated and moving through. Now, one final thing, what has to happen at a funeral is that a laudatio, a kind of a praising speech, has to be delivered over the body of the dead person. effectively, when you're delivering, whoever draws the short straw of having to deliver that oration is delivering it to the dead man, but also, or the dead person, because it could be women as well, and to the ancestors. And the speaker talks about the achievements of the dead man, but also talks about the achievements of the ancestors as well, but is talking to those ancestors and is presenting himself as the next installment of the family. So there's kind of huge pressure on that guy.
Extraordinary, yeah. And also so sort of explicit, and it must have been so competitive with all these different families and who had the most illustrious people. And
no, absolutely, and it's very sort of much like Augustus to be sort of doing something that's terribly traditional. You're sort of putting up a big advertisement saying, I'm just like you guys, I'm as Roman as you come. There's nothing sort of radically different about me. But at the same time, having to prove that he's more significant than
doing it bigger and better than
to be the top.
Do you think he wrote his own laudatio?
There is some suggestion that he did that. Yes.
He was a bit of a control freak, wasn't he?
Yeah. Well, and also one sort of thing that happens after his funeral is that his raised gestae, his account of his own achievements, are put up in front of the mausoleum, and they don't survive there anymore, but the texts survive in Ankara, actually, in Turkey. So yeah, it's not just self-obsession. I mean, the Romans are deeply self-obsessed. They're deeply obsessed with ensuring that they're remembered. But he knows that on his status depends the continuation of this arrangement that he's established.
That's a really fascinating insight into the sort of psychology of the Roman mind. So now let's go to your second scene, which is very, very far away from Rome. A rather sad scene. What are we going to look at? Who are we going to meet?
We're now meeting poor old Ovid, who's as I've mentioned is off on the Black Sea in a town called Tomi, which is now Constanza in Romania, which was probably a perfectly pleasant little town as things go, but when you're Ovid and you've been the toast of Roman society and you've enjoyed the remarkable cultural life of Rome, Tomi is the ultimate backwater. I should explain what he's doing there as well, although it's a fairly complicated story. Ovid has been exiled. He's been sent out of Rome by Augustus, and we don't know in detail. We don't know all the things that caused his exile. He talks about two things that got him exiled: a song and a mistake. And the song is the Ars Amatoria. I mentioned this earlier as the kind of teaching poem where he teaches people how to have love affairs, which if you take it very, very seriously, which is a slightly unfair thing to do, but if you take it very, very seriously, is highly immoral and terrifically contradictory of moral legislation that Augustus has put quite a lot of emphasis on. Augustus is all about sort of taking Rome back to its pristine origins, and Ovid isn't really singing from the same hymn sheet. I think it's probably fair to say. There's also that's the poem, the Ars Amatoria, is part of it, but he's done something else as well. Ovid has done something that has offended Augustus, and we don't know what it was. And he isn't really telling us what it is. He kind of encourages us to sort of wonder what it is, but he won't give information which suggests that it would be too embarrassing for Augustus if he did so. At any rate, in punishment for this, Augustus sends him to the back of beyond, and he stays there for the rest of his life.
And he carries on writing, doesn't he? And he tries to persuade all his influential friends to get him recalled, but that doesn't work. Can you just talk a bit about his poems, because the way he writes changes, doesn't it? He stops writing happy things and starts writing very sad poems and letters.
No, absolutely. His first kind of collection of exile poetry is called the Tristia, which means the sad things. So he's clear about his psychological state. He does write quite a lot of other things in exile. He kind of works on certain poems that he's written before, but the kind of core activity is a series of books. The Tristia, first of all, a few books of those, and a book is a book roll, kind of standard length of an ancient book of poetry. And then after the Tristia, collections described as epistolae ex ponto, letters from the Black Sea. Now, within those two sets of collections, he does quite a lot of pleading directed at Augustus to forgive him and to let him come back again. Over time, he starts to recognise really that he's not going to get back to Rome. That isn't going to happen. So you find more of him just saying, please let me go somewhere else. I don't like this place, which is one of the things that one reason I want to go to Tommy in AD 14 is to discover what's so bad about this place. The epistolae ex ponto are particularly interesting from a kind of historical point of view, because in the Tristia he's not generally naming anybody apart from Augustus. In the epistolae ex ponto, generally he's writing letters to named individuals, and we can see in more detail the efforts he's making to persuade people to just make his life a little bit more pleasant.
Yeah. And isn't there quite a lot of because we don't have very much biographical information about Ovid, and you have to kind of eke it out of his poems, and there's a bit more in the later books, aren't there, than the earlier ones?
Yes, and there's one poem in particular, the Tristia, which is without which we'd really be struggling to know very much about Ovid's life at all. It's a biography he gives at the end of one of the books, but in a more subtle way, the kind of connections that he has that are kind of betrayed in the epistolae ex ponto really sort of confirm his kind of social status in Rome. Who he knows and what his circle is. In the last book of the epistolae ex ponto was probably never published obviously was published because we have it, but not published by Ovid himself. It's probably things that were left by him that were collected together, and they cover we can sort of date some of them, and they cover quite a lot of spread of time. Yeah, but there, for example, 4 of the poems are addressed to one of the consuls for AD 14, Sextus Pompeius, and there's quite a lot of reference to a character, Germanicus, who's a very important figure who we'll probably talk more about later, who's connected with the royal family, and you get a sense of who Ovid can talk to, who he can't talk to. How much power he has to influence people, how much he doesn't.
It must be strange for someone like you who obviously, has studied Ovid in such depth, and you must feel like you know him a bit because of the way he writes. He's one of those poets you can really hear his voice. But then at the same time, there's so many mysteries and gaps about, in your knowledge of what actually happened in his life. That must be an interesting contrast.
No, that's absolutely right, and particularly in the exile poetry. I mean, Ovid's unusual in his earlier poetry for sort of flaunting himself. You can't read the Metamorphoses, for example, the big epic poem on change, without being acutely aware there's a really clever poet that's writing all of this. You get into the exile, and he's still a very clever poet, but he's a very depressed individual indeed, and you're learning so much more about him directly there, explicitly in that poem in the Tristia, but also to an unusual degree, you're you're seeing the psychology of an ancient poet. Ancient poets don't tend to divulge too much about themselves. This is very kind of artificial poetry. But Ovid in Exile is something of an exception to that.
Yeah.
Another point to make, though, is that I love the last book of the Epistola ex Ponto. There's such like a range of material, but also such fabulous examples of carefully created representations of his own psychological state. This is never just Ovid sort of just
blurting it out
and expressing himself in this poetry, but it is in a number of occasions very, very powerful dramatizations of terrible trauma it is for a Roman of his standing suddenly to be sent to this place sort of far from anything he's experienced before.
Hello, it's Artemis. At Travels Through Time, we're incredibly proud to be partnering with Jordan Lloyd and Colourgraph. Jordan is one of the world's leading visual historians. Through his excellent craftsmanship, he brings black and white photographs of the past to life in startling colour and clarity. Jordan's extraordinary work, as well as that of his contemporaries, can be found on the website colourgraph.co. At colourgraph.co, you'll be able to explore the process and history behind the colorization work, but most excitingly of all, you can also buy some of these beautiful photographs as museum-grade fine art prints. They make an unusual and striking present for that friend or family member of yours who loves the past, and they're an excellent addition to any room. Whether it's a colorized photograph of the US Capitol building from 1846, or a candid shot of the Beatles from 1964, you're pretty sure to find something that enchants you. I know I certainly have many times. It's hard to explain really over audio just how cool these prints are, so I encourage you to have a look for yourself at colourgraph.co. What's more, Travels Through Time listeners get 10% off when they enter the code TTT at the checkout.
Yeah, I mean, he was a mesmerising writer, wasn't he? His ability to create scenes in your head. Well, let's go to your third scene, which is another quite fairly long journey, isn't it? Where are we off to next?
Right. Yes, we're sort of heading from the Black Sea along the Danube, and then skipping a bit and going up the Rhine. We're going to the military camps on the lower Rhine. So what would today be Western Germany. And what's happening here is the armies are responding to the news that Augustus has died.
And who's in charge? Who's the leader of this legion or part of the Roman army?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, what are we talking about here? We're talking about 8 legions.
Mm-hmm.
So about roughly 40,000 men or something in that vicinity, who are guarding this critical boundary of the Roman Empire along the Rhine. And the man who's in charge of them is somebody called Germanicus, who I've mentioned already, but now a bit more detail on him. Germanicus is the heir to the throne. If we can call it a throne, that's a little bit anachronistic, but the heir to power once Tiberius has taken over from Augustus. So Tiberius is the emperor that takes over from Augustus at this point, and Germanicus is focus on one way of pronouncing his name. Germanicus is the heir to Tiberius. An indication of his significance is that he's been given control of these armies, because as the commander of this bunch of soldiers, this number of soldiers, he's in a position of enormous power potentially.
And is this the sort of biggest hotspot on the whole frontier of the empire? Is this where there are the most problems? And who are causing the problems? Tribes of Germanic people?
Yeah, I mean, roughly speaking, yeah. I mean, the Danube border and the Rhine border, but in particular the Rhine border is a hot spot. Yeah, I mean, where Ovid is a bit of a hot spot as well. That's something that he
he complains about that too, doesn't he?
Quite a lot, and for a long time we didn't really believe him, but then actually the evidence is quite strong that it was quite a violent place to be. But yes, the place where the soldiers were concentrated and needed to be concentrated in particular are along the Rhine border, and it's the Germanic tribes that are the issue here. Very recent experience. Bad stuff has happened to the Romans in this neck of the woods, literally neck of the woods. One forest, the Teutoburg forest in AD 9, a Roman army has been wiped out by Germans. So it's a border to be that needs to be protected, because if it isn't protected, the Romans are convinced for some reason that peoples from the north will cross over and not just take over the rest of the empire, but invade Italy as well, which kind of happens periodically in Roman history.
And what's the connection between Germanicus, the man who's in charge, and Germany? Can you just clarify that?
It's quite interesting actually. He has that name because his dad was very successful in being violent against the Germans, so he actually inherits that name, but also in a sense kind of earns it himself, because he also has done a lot of fighting in the vicinity of, well, in that kind of area, and doing, I mean, Rome, when its legions have been destroyed, suffered obvious things, but suffered a colossal loss of face as well. And a lot of what Germanicus has been doing in recent times is kind of restoring Roman status over the border. In a sense, kind of earned that name for himself.
And are the tribes who are causing all these problems, are they are they anything to do with are they Goths? Because we think of when the Roman Empire finally sort of collapses in that part of the world, it's very much the Goths and the Alans and the Vandals. Are they?
This is the point where I sort of say, listen, I just emote in front of literary text, don't I?
Sorry.
But those are sort of later developments and later movements, I think. But there is a kind of a complex group, the Roman complex kind of collection of tribal groupings that can periodically be united under people like Arminius, who's the one that wins the battle in AD 9, into a kind of a coherent group that might kind of threaten the settled areas beyond the Rhine.
Yeah, and did Germanicus become emperor after?
No,
Tiberius?
Because he died young, and he
in battle.
Very unclear how he did die. It's one of the problems in antiquity, that because they didn't really understand epidemiology and the rest of it, then they could always kind of imagine that somebody had been poisoned.
Well, probably quite a lot of them were poisoned, weren't they?
Who knows? But yes, there's quite a high possibility. Yeah, Germanicus and Tiberius are have an interesting relationship. I mean, Germanicus is the heir to Tiberius, and he's the adopted son of Tiberius as well, but there's a certain kind of tension there, as when he dies in AD 19, there's sort of suspicions that that foul play had a role to play. Not clear that it did. So he doesn't become emperor. His son becomes emperor, a guy known as Caligula.
Oh, of course, yes.
Whose nickname Caligula comes from the fact that he's the kind of darling of the troops in Germany, and he has little caligae. He has little military hobnail boots.
Oh, I never knew that.
Awfully cute until he becomes emperor. And then Germanicus's brother Claudius also becomes emperor. So Germanicus is a really significant figure who doesn't actually achieve that kind of power himself, because he doesn't survive long enough.
I wonder if he would have been a better emperor than his son.
He's one of the, I mean, something that kind of regularly happens in Roman history. I mean, amongst Romans as well, thinking about it is what if. And Germanicus was regarded as the perfect emperor that we never had. There's an issue with the Rhine armies though, because the reason why I've sort of gone to the Rhine armies is they're mutinying essentially, because after they've heard that Augustus has died, and Germanicus is there now. They're mutinying for all kinds of different reasons. They're mutinying because conditions are not great in the army, and because the armies are essentially controlled by the emperor, so what's going to happen to us now that Augustus has gone? The armies are a peculiar thing, though. They're filled by people who are, some of the most socially kind of insignificant people within a very hierarchical system in Rome. As a collective, though, they have immense power, and they know what power they have. And there are strong hints during the mutinies and in the accounts of the mutinies that one of the things that the armies have in mind is that they might be able to make Germanicus emperor. They might place Germanicus or replace Tiberius with Germanicus. So one of the things that Germanicus is doing out there is saying, I am strictly loyal to Tiberius. Don't ever suggest that anybody has the right to be the leader of Rome than Tiberius.
That's so interesting. And would that have been, the sort of everyday soldiers, or was it the sort of next echelon up in the army, the officers? Or was it all of them? Were they kind of all united in this idea of mutinying and making Germanicus emperor?
The mutiny, we associate the kind of the mutiny with the common soldiers, and the sort of complaints that they have. A lot of them are about kind of the brutal conditions that they suffer from the higher ranks. So we have wonderful, it's horrific actually, but reference to a centurion who had a nickname, Cedo Alteram, which means give me another, which he got because he was always kind of breaking the stick with which he beat soldiers, so he needed another one to beat them with.
And would they have been Italians mainly, or would they have come from all over the empire?
The legions are Roman citizens, so yes, they'd have been.
Oh, wow, okay.
In the main, I mean, there was a certain amount of press ganging, but in the main it would have been a kind of a free process of kind of signing up to it as well. The legions are one part of the forces of Rome. Another part are auxiliaries, which come from subject peoples. But what really matters here is that legionaries, Roman citizens, are mutinying.
And so they have, in a way, a similar problem to Ovid, in that they have been sent far away from Rome, to the back of beyond, where things are not civilized. And I often imagine that what it would have been like to be a Roman, soldier sent from Rome to, I don't know, Hadrian's Wall or something, and have to live in the freezing cold and pouring rain with revolting food. And, it would have been, traumatic, and with all the sort of battles and violence on top of that.
I think that's right. I mean, actually, a lot of the people on places like Hadrian's Wall were auxiliaries, so you had to kind of Dutch people kind of.
Okay, so it wasn't so bad, not such a.
But no, you're right, absolutely right. I mean, it's an interesting question. What are the pluses and minuses of being a member of being a legionary? You get occasional glimpses. I mean, one of the things that I'd like about visiting a legionary camp in AD 14 is that you're not seeing the elite anymore. You're seeing some of the ordinary people.
Yeah.
And in the historical sources, which are sort of the ancient historical sources, which are obviously much more concerned with the elite, generally speaking, you just get these glimpses of mutineers and biographies of them. And there's one of them whose name I will attempt to remember, who's not actually. There are mutinies happening on the Danube border as well, but they're kind of dealt with more easily. And there's a character who's associated with those as a kind of ringleader, who's I think called Percenius, described by Tacitus, if I remember rightly. And he had been a leader of a theatrical claque in Rome. So he'd been somebody who sort of led the applause in sort of theatrical performances. Now, it's a question: how does this guy end up in the army? I mean, he may have just been press ganged or something, but I suppose what the army offered was regular pay. The conditions might not have been great at any particular time, but what they expected and what they ultimately would get is a certain limited period of service, after which they were given a lump sum and retired to a particular place, and so there are colonies around the place which are basically where soldiers have been settled. There is also the Germans and extremely violent conditions, and I'm not just referring to the sadistic centurions. There are other people who want to do even worse to you. So it, I guess, tells you something about the economic conditions of the ordinary person in Rome, that they were kind of prepared to undertake this kind of life.
Absolutely. And of course, for Ovid, living in Rome, in those very elite surroundings and living in a beautiful house and eating lemons that had been sent up from the Amalfi Coast and that kind of thing, that would have been lovely. But for the normal Roman people, it would not have been anything like that anyway. So
and just going back to Ovid for a second, that's where he finds himself. I mean, so Ovid complains a lot in his poetry. I've suggested this already, that it's terrifically violent around here. I've been threatened my life, and people used to say, oh, it's just kind of laying it on a bit. But there's good inscriptional evidence, quite recent inscriptional evidence of quite how unstable the part of the world where he was. And it seems to me that one of the things that Augustus was doing by sending Ovid to Tommy was taking somebody who was kind of taking the peace that Augustus had established for granted, being a little too relaxed, being too much himself, not listening to what Augustus wants to be said, taking that person and basically relocating him to a war zone. There is something quite equivalent to where Ovid is, where Ovid of all people has been sent to in Tommy, and where Germanicus is doing his best to calm down these mutinies that have broken out.
Yeah, fascinating. So there's just one more question that I have to ask you, and that is, if you could have picked something up from one of these scenes and brought it back with you to the present day as a sort of memento of your visit to 14 AD, what would it be, do you think?
Easy. No wax mask such as were worn by these actors representing the ancestors has survived, and no clear representation of what they looked like has survived. So if by whatever means I could not only kind of filch a wax mask of somebody, Romulus maybe, that would be quite nice, and could kind of bring it back to the present day, that would be great, actually. Yeah.
That's a very, very good choice. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I think we've really got some good insights into Rome and the Roman mind. Really, really interesting. Thank you very much, Llewelyn.
Thank you very, very much indeed for having me.
That was me, Violet Moller, speaking to Professor Llewelyn Morgan the other day. A very short introduction to Ovid is out now, and it's a fascinating starting point for anyone wanting to find out more about the legendary poet. And of course, if you'd like to discover more about this episode and see some lovely images, just head to our website, tttpodcast.com. Thanks so much for listening. Goodbye.